Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, fighting poverty. As the United Nations turns 70, we look at what could be its biggest success. The Millennium Development Goals have reduced the number of people living in extreme poverty. We'll find out how.
I'm Catherine Soy in Eastern Rwanda. I'll be telling you about Imbaza Mihigo here and how she's helping Rwanda achieve its Millennium Development Goals.
And also this week, commodities. It's been a tough year for the world's natural resources. We're in Zambia, where copper miners have lost their jobs because of falling demand. And that slowing Chinese economy is also taking its toll on the multi-billion-dollar diamond industry. We'll hear from the CEO of De Beers Forevermark. At the turn of the century, world leaders committed to, and I'm quoting here, spare no effort to free men, women and children from abject and dehumanising conditions of extreme poverty. Words, lots of them. At this time, they have been backed up by actions. 8 Millennium Development Goals was the result of those words, to be reached by September 2015. And with the United Nations General Assembly meeting for the 70th time, there are now plans to outline goals for the next 15 years. Here's a quick recap of some of those Millennium Development Goals and their results. That target of reducing extreme poverty by half, it was met 5 years ahead of deadline. And by extreme poverty, I should say we're talking about people living on less than $1.25 a day. More than 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty. However, 800 million still live below that level today. And so now the UN is proposing 17 new Sustainable Development Goals, which call for an end to poverty in all its forms, everywhere. So to give the UN its dues, this has been a quiet success in amongst all the posturing and unfulfilled talk which goes on at perhaps Security Council level. How have they done it? Well, Catherine Sawyer has this report now from Rwanda. Just one example of how a simple gift keeps on giving and brings a community together.
Kayitesi Clementine has owned her cow for 2 years now. She named it Imbaza Mihigo, loosely translated, achieving goals. Under Rwanda's poverty eradication program, each needy family is given 1 cow. Clementine says that she now has enough milk for her children and a little extra that she can sell at the market. In the spirit of the program, she has to give Imbaza Mihigo's first calf to her neighbor.
I
grew up without a cow. With this cow, I can feed my children, take them to school, and buy clothes. I just wish the same happiness for my neighbor.
That neighbor is Nibagwere Efrace. She lost her 4 sons and husband in the 1994 genocide. Passing on the calf is a way of uniting communities that were deeply divided by those killings. The program also helps reduce poverty and malnutrition, 2 of the 8 Millennium Goals.
When it comes to Millennium Development Goals, Rwanda seems to be getting it right. It's one of the best performing countries, and the reason for this, we're told, is because services have been devolved to the poorest people, and Rwanda's government is using cultural practices to involve communities here.
Rwanda has reached, and in some areas surpassed, the targets that were set at the turn of the century, but the country is still struggling to meet the #1 MDG target.
You have the percentage of the population living on the poverty line. And the second indicator is the employment, dealing with, and the third one is nutrition. But even here, they have really deployed very robust policies.
Rwanda relies heavily on aid for its development agenda. The economy collapsed following the genocide in 1994. But has been growing at a healthy average of 8% annually. Now almost 3/4 of the country's budget is run on local resources. 14% is borrowed internationally and the rest is donor money.
The contribution of the aid in the traditional way was only 20%. We are working very hard to make sure that we can continue to increase the domestic resources so that we could be self-sufficient.
President Paul Kagame's government has been accused of intolerance when it comes to opposition to its rule. But even his fiercest critics will acknowledge Rwanda has become a successful model for the rest of the developing world.
So what will the next 15 years deliver? Let's discuss that with Nikhil Seth. He is the Director for Sustainable Development at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, joining us from New York. Mr. Seth, thank you. To lift 1 billion people out of extreme poverty is a pretty amazing achievement, really, and it feels like it's been a quiet achievement. You know, we hear all about things which don't go so well at the UN, maybe at higher levels, but this has quietly been going on in the background and successfully so.
Thank you so much, Kamal. In fact, the promise now is to end poverty irreversibly, and I use the word irreversibly, by 2030. So that's an even more promising prospect.
By 2030, you say? Because, I mean, that is a big goal. I know you've achieved a lot of these original goals in shorter time, but 2030 is only another 15 years away, and irreversibly eradicating poverty is massive.
The 5 big principles which underline this new agenda, which need to be highlighted because they've never really been focused on before in the United Nations. One is the universality of this agenda. In other words, it's to be done by all countries, rich and poor, big and small. The second is the focus on integration, where you look at issues in an interrelated manner to make sure that these goals are achieved, because poverty is a very complex and multidimensional problem, and the only way you can solve it is by looking at economic, at social and environmental issues together. The third is the issue of leaving no one behind. This is a principle enshrined in this development agenda we are going to adopt tomorrow. The fourth is reaching the furthest first. I love this expression, which is part of this agenda, and if that's the direction we are doing something right. And the fifth is the principle of engagement and the principle of involvement of all actors in government, in academia, in civil society, in the private sector, to make this a reality by 2030.
Okay, take me back, if you would, to the original development goals. Can you tell me and our viewers some real concrete ideas about why they were a success? The 5 things that you've just talked about are quite sort of holistic, if you like, and big picture. I'm interested in how you physically reduce poverty.
Well, this establishment of the Sustainable Development Goals is a triumph of engagement. You know, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which were cobbled together by a bunch of few thinkers and then accepted by the General Assembly, this time we've had a process which has lasted over 3 years, engaged governments, of course, but more importantly, it's engaged academia, the private sector, and civil society as never before. In fact, the Secretary General the other day was mentioning that 8 million people gave their views through an online survey on the world we want and have expressed what they expect from the development agenda of the United Nations. But this time we are looking not only at these social issues, but in much more detail in their linkages with economic and issues of peace and just societies, as also issues of the environment. So this is the first comprehensive agenda that the UN has brought under one umbrella.
On the financial side of things, I'd like to talk about how much of the success of the goals comes down to just transferring of wealth, if I can call it that, i.e. one country, a wealthier country, giving money to a poorer country. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. It's a great thing if countries will do that. But to me, it doesn't really seem to be sustainable in the end, I would say.
That's a very small part of this agenda. Every country, when it looks at its budget, is already covering many of the issues I mentioned on poverty eradication, on health, on education, on gender equality, on protecting the marine ecosystems, on promoting industrialization and growth. These are the bailiwick of most budgets. So what we are doing, of course, is aggregating and saying that this will be a big enterprise. But what we are encouraging governments to do is to redirect their budget in ways that make irreversible poverty eradication possible. So it's not the additionality that's important here, it's the redirection of current amounts into the right avenues for making sustainable development a reality. Of course, there will be additional requirements, there'll be strengthened international cooperation, but that's a small part of a very large a shift in mindsets, a shift in the direction of investments, a shift in the direction of finance.
So again, can you give me an example of how a government might redirect its wealth, as you put it, to eliminate poverty irreversibly? Because again, that is a very big goal.
Economists are used to looking at these things from a cost-benefit analysis, but the problem in many of these costs and benefits is that they are difficult to monetize and difficult to give a dollar value to. So now we are encouraging policymakers all around the globe to look at issues in their interconnectedness so that they can define sensible policy and help governments, therefore, make a sensible choice of where these investments should be. Let's look at the typically strong nexus between water, energy, and food. Now, decisions on water, energy, and food are often made in silos. But now we hope that, for example, looking at issues like drip irrigation, you'll be able to see the connection between drip irrigation, between agriculture, food, and climate change. So we are hoping that approaches, whole of government approaches, where you bring in different ministries to make these decisions together, based on policy optimization, that will become the norm in decision making rather than the exception.
Okay, can I just get a final thought from you then on climate change? Because that has to be, I mean, we've talked a lot about poverty as a whole, but I feel that climate change will have a huge effect on poverty, where people live, how they live. I guess, can you tell me how climate change fits into the Sustainable Development Goals, especially with the big Paris Climate Change Conference coming up quite soon?
Climate change is probably the biggest uncertainty out there, and unless we get climate change right, both in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and more ambitious action by all countries, we are going to fail in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, because climate change and the pernicious impact it has on all the SDGs, whether it's food or water or agriculture or you name it, all the goals have a connection with climate change. Unless we have the finance and the technology to make that a reality, I think these are conjoined twins at the hip, and you can't achieve sustainable development without an equally ambitious outcome at the Paris conference.
Nikhil Seth from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals Division. We thank you so much for your time this week. So as we discussed there, another goal for the next 15 years is to take urgent action on climate change. Now, a warming planet is making the effects of the El Nino weather system more unpredictable. The strongest El Nino ever was back in 97-98 and was responsible for an estimated $45 billion in damage and 23,000 deaths worldwide. With a look at the impact of El Nino in Indonesia, here's Stephen.
Anxiously waiting for water. Wells in Wonogiri in Indonesia's central Java have run dry after nearly half a year without rain. Suwardi has sold his only goat just to be able to buy water. One tank costs around $10. That's a huge amount for the poor farmer.
We are trying to drink less now, and the usual 3 buckets of water I used to wash myself has been reduced to 1. My grandchild usually used 2 buckets, but she also now gets only 1.
Monsoon rains are expected to start 2 months later than usual because of the weather phenomenon known as El Nino. Already half of the crops have failed. Even the local staple cassava, which doesn't need a lot of water, is not growing. This lake is an important source for drinking water, but for the last 5 months it has been dry. Nearly half a year without a single drop of water, and normally tropical and lush Java starts to look more like a desert. People in the worst hit areas are already getting very worried about their food and drinking supplies. But these dire weather conditions are going to stay here for some time to come. The government has started the process of what's called cloud seeding in an effort to create rain. Planes flying over the worst hit areas in Java are releasing salt into the clouds, a procedure that causes raindrops to become heavy and fall. But because there aren't enough clouds, the results are limited. Authorities have also distributed thousands of water pumps, but without any water sources like in Wonogiri, farmers are struggling.
The harvest from last year has finished already, and we don't know when it will start to rain. So I'm really worried about food supplies.
The government insists food stocks are still sufficient, But experts say this is too optimistic. The Ministry of Agriculture admits the effects of El Nino have yet to be calculated.
We have enough stocks for the next few months. What I'm worried about is if El Nino lasts beyond November, then we'll have to recalculate and we might be forced to import rice.
Millions of affected farmers can't wait that long. Nearly 100,000 hectares of rice harvest has failed already. Suwardi and other farmers are now depending on financial support from the government for food and other basic necessities like drinking water.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, a slowing world economy, jittery markets, currency depreciations. Everyone's feeling the effect, even the multi-billion-dollar diamond market. We'll hear from De Beers a little later. So in this half of the programme, we're looking at minerals and mining. In a moment, diamonds, as we said. But first, copper. The price of copper's taken a hit over China's falling demand, which consumes half the world's supply. That has had a knock-on effect in the mines of Zambia, which is Africa's second biggest producer. Famida Miller explains more.
Thousands of families in Zambia's northern city of Kitwe depend on the local copper industry. One of those families is the Chindeshas. But Friedrich Chindesha's lost his job after global copper prices hit a slump.
I'm going through a hard time because as a family man, I've got children who are going to school. So it's hard for me to survive at the moment.
He's now looking for temporary work, but that doesn't earn him as much as mining.
This is a mine area. Most of the people here depend on the mine. People in the market, in the bars, all those running small barber shops. It's the little penny they get is from the miners. So it's in fact it's a catastrophe.
The price of copper is the lowest it's been in 6 years. And a slowdown in primary consumer China's economy means a drop in demand for the metal. The president of Zambia's Chamber of Mines says the government needs to adapt its policies if it wants to increase its income.
What makes Zambia particularly vulnerable is it's a mono-commodity country. So we depend very much on one mineral, which is copper. So fluctuations in that mineral price do have very deep implications for the economy in general.
While higher taxes for mining companies have impacted the industry, mining bosses are also concerned about a countrywide electricity shortage.
But authorities say the mining industry won't be severely disrupted as long as regulators understand just how much power is needed to keep the mines running.
This is the Konkola Deep's copper mine in Chingola, one of the wettest mines in the world, with thousands of cubic meters of water flowing into and pumped out of its shafts every day.
The moment we stop pumping the water, then we flood the mine. So we need electricity all the time.
The mine is the largest user of power in the country. It consumes 14% of available electricity.
It will put a crimp on, obviously, how much you can do operationally, and hopefully doesn't get to a situation where you have to have cutbacks in production.
While industry bosses and the government consider their options and a possible bailout by the International Monetary Fund, all that matters to Friedrich is how to support his family.
And from copper mines to diamonds, and just because they're a luxury item doesn't mean they're immune from the slowing Chinese economy and the stock market routes and the currency depreciation. The $80 billion diamond industry is actually facing a tough 2015. Prices for rough diamonds have tumbled 15% this year, and De Beers, the biggest diamond producer and seller of rough diamonds, has been forced to lower prices and cut production. We're off to Hong Kong now to talk to someone from De Beers. Stephen Lussier is the CEO of De Beers' Forevermark brand. Stephen, nice to see you. Every week on this program, really, we talk about emerging markets declining, we talk about currencies devaluing. How does a diamond company operate in those conditions? How much has it affected your business?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a turbulent world we live in today, and diamonds, you know, as the ultimate luxury product, we're certainly not immune from the turbulence. But actually, not too bad if we look at the consumer scene. 2014, record year for diamond sales worldwide, broke through the $80 billion mark for the first time in terms of the amount of money spent in jewelers around the world. Growth in virtually all the major markets in 2014. 2015, you know, it's been a little bit more challenging, largely due to a slowdown in the rate of growth in China. Not to be confused with a decline, but rather than growing at those very high double-digit rates, we're seeing growth, you know, of 2, 3, 4% in China. And that means that when we put that all into dollars, with the stronger dollar, we look all around the world, we probably sold the same sort of value of diamond jewelry in the first half of 2015 as we did in the record 2014. So, you know, not a bad result given the environment we find ourselves in.
As I understand it, Stephen, there are actually fewer diamonds actually available these days, fewer mines coming online, if I put it that way, which sounds like a bad thing if you're talking about the fact that there is still some demand. But conversely, is that good for prices?
I think when it comes to diamond demand and supply, you really need to take a pretty long-term view. And there's no doubt that if you look at the world's major mines, that they are getting old. And as mines get older, obviously some will close, but others become less productive. And so the supply issue is a real one, but I think it's something we look out to the next decade rather than this one. There's likely to be consistent or even, you know, a small increase in the level of production from existing mines. De Beers is going to open a new mine, building it now up in the Northwest Territories in Canada, up near the Arctic Circle. And that will come on to production probably the end of next year. And there's a few other smaller projects from other producers that will add. So there's a little bit of growth in supply, but you're quite right. You look past 2020 and it's hard to see where new production is going to come from. And when you look at the supply-demand balance looking out like that, you can't help think that, you know, long run there'll be an increase in price.
Let's talk about competition, Stephen. Russia is a big player in the diamonds industry, the biggest producer. And there is a company which is Alrosa, I think it's called, isn't it? Which I guess is like the...
Alrosa,
yeah. It's the Russian version of you guys, the second largest marketer. How seriously do you regard the competition there in Russia? Russia sending more of its rough diamonds to India to be polished and sold. They're obviously an important player.
We're a normal competitive industry. De Beers is the world's leading producer by value, but you know, we've got a market share, you know, in the 30%, and Russia through Alrosa not far behind. And then there's a number of other smaller producers: Rio Tinto, Dominion, Petra, etc. So, like any industry, we've got our competitors. The focus for us at De Beers is obviously having the right client base with strong clients in all the major cutting centers of the world. And also strong brands.
Is there somewhere where you are really pouring your resources into right now? If China is really slowing down, as we've discussed, then somewhere like maybe India perhaps is where you've got a growing, more affluent middle class. Is that somewhere you would target? Tell me more about where you see De Beers' future.
India is 3 times the size as a market it was 10 years ago. It represents upwards of 8% today of world demand at consumer level for diamonds. And again, the opportunities there for growth are substantial. There's an emerging middle class consumer in India becoming able economically to buy diamonds for the first time. Historically, they bought huge volumes of gold jewelry, so they're into the habit of buying and wearing jewelry. And we're introducing them to diamonds.
All right, Stephen Lussier from De Beers joining us from Hong Kong this week. We thank you for your time, Stephen. And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. It'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting me at KamalAGE. There's also our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you tweet us, or drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. That is it, though, for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.